And again, thank you everyone for being with us. I'm going to get a sip of water and we're going to go ahead and get started. So the title today, if you've seen the email, saw the email that I sent out, was "It's a Mad, 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 Mad World." And of course that was a movie back in the 70s. There were other titles from back then. Of course, those were kind of disturbing times as well. There were other titles from back then that we could have gone with today. You know, "Stop the World, I Want to Get Off." I don't know if you remember the play. It became a movie, and then of course Ray Price had a big hit with the song "Make the World Go Away." But I was starting to see, as I was reading through the messages that people were posting on Facebook, and some messages that people were sending directly to me personally. There was this kind of this frustration that was building up, and people saying, "What in the world is going on? We have all of these terrible things that are happening, and it seems at times like the world has gone mad, literally gone mad. That there's an anger that is welling up, that there's a violence that is welling up." And when things like this happen, people naturally ask a couple of questions. You know, the first one is where is God in all this? Why does God do this? Why does God allow this to happen? You know, if God knows everything and God is in charge of everything, and then why is God allowing this to happen? Why doesn't God come and intervene? And then the other thing that goes on is people want it to change. Somehow they want it to change. What can be done to bring about change? Now, we're going to talk more about that, but typically when people say that, what they mean is, what can I do to make somebody else change? What can I do to get those people over there, whoever those people happen to be? What can I do to get those people to change? So this is not a political discussion. I'm not going to get into civic action and things like that. Some churches and denominations do that. What we teach is that every person at the center of their being knows what to do. There's a knower within them that knows what to do. And what we try to do is help people to reach that knower and to get into contact with that knower. So we're going to look at this from a spiritual point of view. We're going to kind of look at this in terms of, what does this say about the human race and the spirituality of the human race? What is it that we can possibly do to make the situation better for our own selves and for each and every person? So the first thing that I want to point out, and I'm not trying to make things worse than they are, but the first thing I just want to point out is that we have been exposed to some things here in this country in the last month that kind of are bringing things to a head. But the kind of things that we are seeing are not new. They are not new. If you take a bigger picture and go, certainly in our country things happen that we don't hear about every day, but if you go into the world at large, there are atrocities that are happening every day. And they have been happening every day since history began. There have been genocides, there have been mass murders, there have been all kinds of terrible things that human beings do to one another. You know, probably the most horrific one that occurred in recent history was the Holocaust. You know, and we have to look at something like that and say, how in the world could one group of people do this to another? How could anyone of good conscience even be involved in something like this? It just boggles our mind. But we have to understand that even today, even in nations around the world today, genocide is still taking place. It is still going on. During the Second World War, while the Nazis were busy exterminating the people that they wanted to get rid of, there were other groups in other European countries that set up their own extermination camps and went after their favorite group that they wanted to get rid of, their favorite ethnic group, ethnic cleansing. And we have to look at this and say, it happened. It happened. Why in the world do human beings do this to one another? And what happens to us here in our country, we have to keep in mind is that the media is a business, and they get paid for delivering an audience to advertisers, and they will present in the news that which is going to have the most appeal. And for most people, what has the most appeal is something that's local, something that's happening in our own country or in our own backyard. So we tend to be distracted. We tend to look away, and we tend to forget that overall, if we look at the situation of the world, that the kind of things that we're talking about, even though we have become more aware of them, they are not necessarily new. As I say, our mind wanders quickly. When we try to learn how to meditate, we become keenly aware of that. I'll give you an example of several years ago when there was the earthquake in Haiti, and people were without homes, and tent villages were being set up, and there was a great call to action, and celebrities were flying their personal airplanes into Haiti trying to bring supplies in, and charities were raising all kinds of money. It was very much in the news for a couple of weeks, very much in the news. And then it just kind of went away. It just kind of died out of the news. Then there was kind of a scandal, and somebody came along and said, well, these charities were raising all of this money to build houses for people, but the houses never got built. What happened to the money? And that kind of came up, and it stayed in the news. And then it too went away as public consciousness got distracted. And then I was watching the news one day, and a hurricane was coming. A hurricane was coming towards Haiti. And during the weather forecast, the person giving the weather report said, and it was especially troubling because there were still many hundreds of thousands of people who were living in tents in Haiti. And it just struck me, that while the earthquake was still fresh in people's minds, there was this big uproar, there was this big cry for action, and everybody got busy, and they did something for 2 weeks, and then we move on to other things, and no one has gone into, if you go back and look at the history of Haiti, which is kind of the poorest nation in our hemisphere, and go back into the 5 levels of why and start to deal with the human consciousness and understand why can this be, Why is it that human beings allow this to happen to one another? And we do something superficial. We try to put a Band-Aid on it. We try to send tents and water and things like that. But when it comes to doing the real work, the work of getting down into human consciousness, finding out what is in our belief system that allows these things to happen, we move on. We go do something else. We change the channel, or the ice cream truck comes down the street and we run out. Something, anything to get us away from the task at hand. So my first point is, I don't want to, as I say, I don't want to make things worse than they are, but I just want to point out that as students of our spiritual nature, we have to understand that everything that is happening in the world is an outpicturing of human consciousness. And that human consciousness has not changed very much in all of recorded history. And that human consciousness that is responsible for the atrocities that we have witnessed in our own country within the last week and the last month, that exists everywhere. And these kind of things go on everywhere. It's just that we don't always hear about it because it isn't always newsworthy as far as the corporate interests that want to give us news that will sell advertising. So I think if we want to go beyond the superficial, if we want to go beyond the outrage that we're seeing and we're feeling, we have to be willing to go and look at the bigger picture. We have to be willing to go and say, this is not something that's going to change overnight. This is not something that there is a quick and simple answer for. And it is going to require some dedication to delve into the causes in human consciousness that are responsible for the outpicturing. And if we are willing to do that, then maybe we can go and make a difference in our lives and in our world. So we look at these things and we say, how could this happen? And probably one of the first conclusions I can come to is it happens because we as human beings believe it should happen. Not you and I personally, but we as human beings, we the collective consciousness believe that it should happen. Everything that happens for a reason. It happens because the consciousness that is involved believes that it should happen. I know it sounds terrible. We can say, well, who in their right mind would think that this is a way to behave, to shoot people, to kill people? Who in their right mind would believe that this is a way that we should do things? But nevertheless, human consciousness does, and human consciousness justifies its actions. And we have to accept that. We don't have to like it, but we have to accept that that is the way it is. That as deranged as some of these acts seem, that to those involved at the time, it probably made sense at some level. It probably seemed reasonable. That's, to me, that is the scariest part, that it seems reasonable. Not too awfully long ago, and people are still arguing about it today, it seemed reasonable to drop nuclear bombs on cities where we knew we would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians, innocent people. But it seemed reasonable. So we have to understand that what we are dealing with is the very consciousness itself, the very thoughts, the very beliefs, the very values that people hold. So we come to the issue then, and we say, well, but why in the world does God allow this to happen? Where is God in the middle of all of this? And I think it's to some extent that kind of question is still coming from a belief of separation, a belief of victim consciousness. God is out there somewhere. God does things to us. God allows things to happen. God sends things to us. God gives us pain and suffering for our own good. All of these old ideas are still very, very much a part of race consciousness. And human beings, instead of taking responsibility for their own consciousness, for their own beliefs, for their own values, for their own thoughts, it's easier to project it someplace out there, to say, well, God should have done something about this. But we understand, in our teaching, we understand that the divine created us out of itself and left us alone to make that discovery. And it had to leave us alone to make that discovery so that we would be individuals. Otherwise, there would be no differentiation. Right? Everything would be the same. We'd all be little automatons, as Ernest Holmes says, little robots. And in this process of remembering who we are, discovering who we are, we're kind of working our way back to the garden. In this process, we have adopted beliefs that are simply not true. And we act out of those beliefs that are simply not true. And we do unkind and unloving things to one another. Now, the divine doesn't step in and stop us from doing that, because that is part of our growth process. That is part of our learning and part of our growing. And we stop and we look at that and we say, but how could that be? Isn't it so terrible? Isn't man's inhumanity to man so terrible? And it is terrible. But we have to step back and look at the big picture. In the grand scheme of eternity, nothing is lost. In the grand scheme of forever, the sufferings in this lifetime dissolve into nothingness. So if we start to think of this as if we are spiritual beings in a spiritual universe, that we are eternal, and that these experiences that we are having and that the world is having are only some experiences out of many, many, many experiences, as terrible as they are, as evil as they seem, we will all get over it. We will all get over it. But it is up to us to do so. And I think that's the key right there, is it is up to us to do so. So if you look at what's going on in the public outrage right now, everybody has a quick fix solution to the problem as they see it. And usually that solution requires somebody else to change. The world would be okay if only those people over there would do this differently. The world would be okay if only those people over there would do that differently. And what we're not seeing is the sense of unity, the sense of oneness. We're not seeing the we, the all-inclusive we. We are not seeing the we that says what is going on here is a reflection of human consciousness, and it reflects the human experience and the human belief and the human idea of separation. We are separated from our God. We are separated from each other. We are even separated from ourselves. Right? Jungian psychology tells us about the dark side. That part of ourself that we don't even want to acknowledge. So we start to ask ourselves, well, what is it that we can do to change? What is it that we can do to bring about change? And the first thing that we have to understand, which is why I started with the world consciousness, the first thing that we have to do is we have to understand the issue. We have to understand what's going on. See, very often when something happens and people clamor for change, the very change that you're clamoring for usually will not do anything to solve the problem. In many cases, it will make the problem worse. And in some cases, it has nothing to do with the problem, but the change that they're clamoring for is an agenda that they've held for a long time, that they just want to see pushed through. And somehow, if they can associate it with whatever's going on out there in the world, they will get their agenda through. So we have to come back and ask ourselves, what is the fundamental cause? What is the root cause of this issue? And I don't know that we will get to the root cause, or that there is one root cause, but we can get closer to it. And as I said, the cause is deep-rooted in human consciousness. It is deep-rooted in the human race consciousness, as Ernest Holmes would call it, or the collective unconscious, as Carl Jung might call it. But there is deeply rooted within human beings this belief in separation, this belief in otherness, this belief in what I call transactional relationships, this belief in other people are just here for me to use, for me to get what I want from them. And if they don't have anything for me that I want, then they're of no use to me. That is the way that much of the human race believes. Why should they care about anyone else? Why should we care about anyone else? And typically in human consciousness, it is not because they have an innate value as a human being, that they are a beautiful expression of God, but we only concern ourselves with them. We, the human race, only concerns itself with them to the degree of they have something we want, or somehow they're annoying us, something along that nature. But if they don't have anything we want and they're not annoying us, we pretty much don't pay much attention to them. We've got other things to do, and we go on. So the first thing in human consciousness that we deal with then is this sense of separation, the sense of difference, the sense of other. And I put a quote on my Facebook page, and it's a quote from Ernest Holmes that says, "I am not my brother's keeper. I am my brother. I am my brother." There's a very, very different way of looking at the world, you know. In Christianity, Jesus says, "You and I are one, and I and the Father are one." We're one. We're all one, you see. We're all little sparks of the same divine. And the world eventually, I don't know if the world will, but the beings within the world eventually must awaken to this oneness. Must awaken to it. Not see ourselves as different than and separate from, but seeing ourselves as part of ourselves, seeing each other as part of ourselves. And this is where compassion comes in. This is where empathy comes in. This is where realizing that everybody is hurting. Everybody is hurting. And they are acting out of ignorance. They are acting out of pain. They are acting out of fear. And it is these human beliefs associated with ignorance and with pain, with fear, that continue to cause the pain and suffering. You know, you see the posters that said, "Hurt people, continue to cause the pain and suffering. The second thing in human consciousness that contributes, in my view, to the problem is this idea of victim-victor. In level 1 consciousness, people tend to think of themselves as the victim or the victor. That's all. If you're on the bottom, you want to be on the top. If you're on the top, you don't want to wind up back on the bottom. So you either want to be winning, or you want to, or if you're losing, you want to figure out how to be a winner. If you're a winner, you want to figure out how to stay a winner. So what happens as a result of this belief in victim-victor consciousness is that very much the pendulum just swings from one side to another, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And the things and the ideas and the people who are on top today, well, they'll be on bottom tomorrow. And the people who are oppressed today, they'll be on top tomorrow. Look at the French Revolution, for example. You know, everything turned upside down. So what happens is because people believe in the necessity of the struggle, they focus on what to fight. They focus on how to beat the other side into submission through force, through the media, through public opinion, through all of these things. They just, they want to win. And they believe that all of their problems are due to somebody else. And I'm not taking sides in this. I'm telling you, this is everybody involved, everybody in the race consciousness involved. Believe their problems are due to somebody else. If somebody else would only behave in a different way, there wouldn't be a problem. And nothing's going to get better until other people change. And what they try to do is to force that change through public outcry and public outrage. And what I learned when I was in the change business, organizational change, we called that drilling holes in water. It doesn't change anything. It gives the appearance that something's happened. There's a lot of noise and there's stuff splashing around. But as soon as you take the drill away, everything goes back the way it was. As soon as you take the outrage away, everything goes back the way it was. So it's not until each and every one, or it's not, I won't say each and every one, but it's not until the individuals involved start to recognize that there is something that they can do within themselves, something that they can do within themselves to stop contributing to the problem. Because this victim-victor clash mentality is the problem. This idea of separation is the problem. So at some point what happens to individuals, and this is just, perhaps purely at the human level, they start to realize that what they're doing is ineffective. And they start to wonder, well, what is it that we can do to bring about real change, to bring about meaningful change? Right? Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. The world has been doing the same thing over and over again for at least 4,000 years that we know, and we still expect different results. So we come to this, now we start to come to the spiritual nature of the issue. And the spiritual nature of the issue is that what we see going on is a consequence of humanity's belief in separation. And it is a consequence of the level of consciousness that chooses to see itself as either a victim or a victor, and not as an empowered being, a co-creator, who has the ability to break out of the dream, break out of the insanity. It's a mad, 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 mad world. Let's stop it so we can get off. Let's remove ourselves from this cycle of insanity that keeps reinforcing itself over and over and over again. And the names and places change over history. The names of the groups involved change over history. The names of the individuals, the names of the issues. But if we go back and look at the root causes, I think we will come down to this idea of a belief in separation and this idea of a belief of victim-victor. So if we as individuals start to recognize that perhaps the ultimate solution or the long-term solution requires a shift in consciousness. And that's not to say that actions cannot and should not be taken immediately to address the immediate needs at the level that the human race is capable of doing right now. Certainly those things should be done, but those things alone will never bring about change. Those things alone will bring about temporary change, the illusion of change. And a consciousness will eventually recreate the same conditions over and over again, because consciousness believes that's the way it ought to be. It's the way it should be. It's the way it is. It's the way it always has been. It's the way it always will be. So if what we are dealing with then is we are dealing with an issue of collective consciousness, of an idea of separation, of an idea that we have to be on the top. What was it? The TV show Hill Street Blues, I think it was, where every morning the sergeant would send the police officers out and he'd say, you do it to them before they do it to you. We have that mindset. We have that mentality in our culture. We have to do it first before somebody else does it to us. It's not do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's do unto others first so they can't get to do it to you. That's in our culture. It's ingrained. We believe that. So as spiritual beings, we can look now at cause and effect. The effects are what we're seeing in the media. The effects are the atrocities that we're seeing that are very, very visible in our consciousness simply because they are very close. However, if we look a little bit further, as I said at the beginning, we would see that they're there all the time. They're there in other places all the time. It's just that our media doesn't pick it up. And the reason that they exist in other places all the time is because human consciousness exists in other places all the time. So what the challenge, if we want to call it a challenge, what the task at hand then is to understand, how does human consciousness change? What can you and I do? How can we be God's instrument of peace, right? The prayer of St. Francis, "O Lord, make me an instrument of peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon." How do we do that? And I believe the first thing that we have to realize is that we, you and I, we are not going to go out and take a magic wand and wave it over all of humanity, and suddenly all human beings are going to wake up, recognize the insanity of what they're doing, lay down their weapons, and go hug one another. That is not going to happen. It doesn't happen that way. And if we, you and I, if we as compassionate beings who are moved to action, who want to do something, if we think that what we need to do is figure out how to get all of those people out there to change, see, then we are stuck in the drama ourselves. We are stuck in the dream. This comes back to a theory that I've used in class several times that I just want to put out. It's the evaporation theory versus the boiling water theory. You take a pan of cold water, you put it on the stove, you turn up the heat, and after a while, that water, all of the water in the pan is at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's still water. And then what happens is the 212 degree Fahrenheit water continues to absorb heat. And at some point it has absorbed enough heat that it becomes 212 degrees steam. The point is that that whole pan of water is ready to become steam at a moment's notice. It just has to have a little bit more heat added. And when we want the entire human consciousness to change altogether at the same time, what we are wanting it to do is we are wanting it all to reach the boiling point. We want it to come to the point where we're ready to awaken to our spiritual nature. This is the idea of rapture and second comings and things like this. This is the idea where one day God is going to just make it all better all at once. Then you have the evaporation theory. You have a puddle of water out on the street. It's 90 degrees outside. Clearly water boils at 212 degrees, yet it's 90 degrees outside. And if you watch the puddle's getting smaller and smaller all of the time. Well, how can this be? Water needs to be at 212 degrees before it boils. What's going on here? And it's a different process. It's a process of evaporation. And what is happening is the entire puddle is not being raised to a temperature of 212 degrees. The entire puddle is not at a point where it is ready to boil yet. But individual molecules within that puddle of water are absorbing heat from the sun. And individual molecules absorb enough heat that they reach what the scientists call escape velocity. They start bouncing back and forth so fast that they reach what is called escape velocity. And they individually turn to steam. So you put the pan of water on the stove, you bring it to a boil, and you can watch and you can see the steam coming off of it. You watch that puddle all day, not very often you see the steam coming out of it. Because it is happening slowly. It is an individual process. Molecules, one by one, are reaching escape velocity. And if we look at spiritual growth, if we look at enlightenment, which is what we're talking about, or awakening, or liberation, or salvation, whatever term you want to use for it, we are talking about the human consciousness coming to the point where it stops believing itself to be human, where it starts recognizing itself as spiritual, where it understands that in a spiritual world where there are laws of cause and effect, that it is its own beliefs, it is its own deeply held values, that it is the human consciousness's own deeply held values that are causing these problems. And the desire to change then becomes a motivating force that the consciousness very deliberately takes what actions it needs to change. So if we are waiting for that to happen all at once to everybody in the world, all at the same time, perhaps next Tuesday at midnight, we are wasting our time. We are wasting our time because it doesn't happen that way. It's not going to happen that way. It may eventually, over eons and eons and eons and eons, But as Emmett Fox tells us, if you go back and look at what you read in the Bible about the Pharaoh and Moses, you understand it. You can relate to it. You can understand when the Pharaoh gets angry. You can understand when his ego gets in the way and he does certain things. You can understand that because we are not so far removed in consciousness from the way people were 4,000 years ago. Yes, there has been some advancement. Most of our advancement has been in technology, not in consciousness. So we have better tools and we have better techniques than the Pharaoh had. But we understand that consciousness, you see. We understand that mindset because we are not so different. And Dr. Fox's point in telling us that is that human consciousness, even though it is evolving very slowly, even though human consciousness is slowly working its way into the realization of the presence of God right in our midst, it doesn't happen very quickly. Collectively, it doesn't happen very quickly. But always within that collective consciousness, there are individuals. There are individuals in small groups that come into awakening. There are the Buddhas, the Christs, the individuals who come into a point of recognizing their spiritual nature. So what we want to consider today is, well, what can we do? What can you and I do? This is a problem of consciousness. It is truly a spiritual problem. It is a problem in consciousness, and collective consciousness does not change very quickly. So are we doomed? We just sit here and throw up our hands and do nothing and say, stop the world, I want to get off. Or do we identify what it is that we can do and do it? What is it that you and I as individuals, what is it that we can do and how do we do it? So we've identified then that the problem is a problem in consciousness. It is a problem in human belief. It is a problem that is rooted in separation, the belief in separation. It is a problem that is rooted in this idea of victimhood. Everybody thinks they had no choice but to do what they did. This week the British government released a report on the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and it was kind of a scathing report about Tony Blair. But if you listen to the politicians, if you listen to the justification that was given to us when we went to war, was we had no choice. We had no choice. So even the leaders of the most powerful nations in the world at this time fall back into the belief of victimhood, that they have no choice. They had no choice but to go and do what they did as a means of justifying their actions. So we believe in separation. Those people aren't like us. They need to change. We believe in victimhood. We have no choice but to fight back in the way that we fight back and to do the things that we need to do. That is the way that the human consciousness explores. The human consciousness rationalizes. The human consciousness justifies. As spiritually, we have to say stop. Stop, stop, stop. That is the way it seems to be, but that is not the truth. I am a spiritual being. I am a conscious being. And I have at my disposal the knowledge and the tools to change consciousness. Now, I recognize that I cannot go out there and change collective human consciousness all on my own, all at once. I cannot do that. It is up to the individuals who are part of that collective consciousness to awaken, to desire to change their own consciousness. Now, certainly dissatisfaction with the status quo serves as a motivation factor to get people started. But if they're working in the wrong direction, if they're trying to do the wrong things, they will have little result. So what we want to do is we want to come to this point that says what I can do is I can clear up that part of consciousness which I am responsible for, which is my own consciousness. I also recognize that my own consciousness is part of the collective consciousness, so that by taking responsibility and taking action to clear up my own consciousness, I am in some way affecting all of consciousness. And I am also serving as a light. So that if I'm not caught up in the drama, if I'm not caught up in the insanity of the world, if I am moving in a direction that is moving my own self out of it, others may see that and they may desire, excuse me, they may desire to know how. They may desire to know what it is that I'm doing. Kind of like we talked from time to time about the running the 4-minute mile and how that was a barrier in consciousness, and people didn't believe it could be done. Not everybody, certainly Roger Bannister and his coach believed it could be done, but many people believed it was physiologically impossible for the human body to run that fast. But when Roger Bannister did it, within a month several other people did it. See? So if you and I can stay out of the fray, if you and I can stay above it in terms of consciousness and recognize what's going on as an outpicturing of human consciousness, and what we wish to do is change human consciousness, the only place we can, which is within ourselves, then others might see that it is possible as well. So the first thing we have to recognize is we can't help if we're part of the drama. We can't get caught up in the drama and be part of it. We can be compassionate. But to be compassionate and to get involved doing something that has absolutely no effect is also insane. Right? To be compassionate. We feel the pain, we feel the suffering, and we want to do something that is meaningful. Which means that we want to bring ourselves out of the drama and into the realization that the only thing that we can do is to work on a change in consciousness. Emmett Fox tells us that prayer is the only thing that changes consciousness. And of course he meant affirmative prayer. He was teaching treatment at the time. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it that prayer changes consciousness? And Joel Goldsmith tells us from his point of view that it is the contact with the presence of the divine, the experience of God, the presence of God, that really changes our consciousness. And affirmative prayer leads us into that contact. Treatment leads us into that contact. We start off by recognizing that whatever the issue seems to be, the insanity in the world today, that the divine mind is not part of it, that God is perfect peace, God is perfect calm, God is perfect love. There's never been a war in the mind of God. There's never been hate in the mind of God. There's never been genocide in the mind of God. That God is completely unaffected by these things that we see. We stay with that idea until it moves us, until we get it, until it moves us. Now, when we just say it, we don't just say the words, but we stay with that idea until it starts to move us. God is all there is. God is perfect, whole, and complete. God is love. That includes each and every person, each and every one. And we declare that right now, this very day, that these ideas of separation, these ideas of victim or victor, all of these human ideas are dissolving into the nothingness from which they came. We give thanks that it is so, and we release our treatment to that law. We continue to work on our own consciousness and identify any prejudices within our own consciousness, any ideas of separation within our own consciousness. We catch ourselves when we get caught up in the drama, when we really get so caught up in it that we get angry and we just want to do something. And we recognize that we have now reached the point where we are of no help. We are of no help. We take a step back. We bring ourselves into the secret place of the Most High. We bring ourselves back into consciousness. And we recognize that God is all there is. And we do the one thing that we can do to help. We stay out of the drama and we stay into the truth. Now this does two things. First of all, it helps us to feel better. It helps us to get out of the negative emotions. But it also helps us to experience the presence of God, which results in a change in our consciousness, which results in a change in all consciousness. So I invite you to consider then this day, as we go into this week, as we are inundated, every time we turn on the news, we're inundated with more and more stories of more and more atrocities and more terrible things happening. We're not here to take sides. We're not here to declare that the problem belongs to one side or another side or a third side or a fourth side. We're here as spiritual beings to recognize that the problem is a problem in human consciousness. And out of our compassion, out of our desire to be helpful, we do the one thing that we know can help. And we avoid doing all of the other things that we know cannot help. We bring ourselves to blessing the situation and the individuals involved. We bring ourselves to recognizing that the presence and the love of God is within each and every person, and we invite it to come forth. We invite ourselves to let go of each and every idea that we hold, that it is an idea of separation, of victimhood. And we allow the love of God, the presence of God, and the experience of God to produce its changes in our consciousness so that we may be of greater help to the world, to our own selves. So let's not get caught up in the fray at the human level. Let's get involved at the spiritual level. Let's do what we can do to improve human consciousness, starting the only place we can, with our own selves. New Testament tells us we are more concerned with the splinter in our brother's eye than the plank in our own. And that was Jesus saying, you have to start on yourself. Gandhi is often quoted as saying, be the change you wish to see in the world. Now, while there's some doubt as to whether Gandhi actually said that or not, it is still true. We must be the change we wish to see in the world. Do you wish to see the world more loving, more respectful, kinder, gentler? Be that. Use your spiritual practice to be that. And so it is.